welcome in everybody. I think it's 7. We'll go ahead and get started here. Dads, raise your hand. If you don't have a handout, raise your hand. Dad will chase you down. I know he's printed out a whole bunch of them. So we're going to be pretty ambitious tonight. We're going to try and kind of wrap up chapter 8 and also cover kind of the first half of chapter 5. I don't know if we'll do that or not. We'll see. But if we don't, we'll pick up the rest of 5 on Sunday. So we'll do our best. But before we get started tonight, I've asked our brother John Biles to lead us in a prayer as we get started with our study. Yeah, I want to echo John's thoughts. It's always an encouragement to be with you guys and spending time in the Word, and I just want to thank you for taking time to be here. We could all come up with a million excuses of things we could be doing and not be here, but I really appreciate you guys being here. It's an encouragement to me. So we're going to try to cover the rest of chapter 8. When I realized we were going to try and do that, I was like, this is going to be, there's a lot in chapter 8 that we kind of didn't get to, and of course we missed class with the snow day and stuff, so we're going to try to cover that quickly this evening. I'm not going to try to spend too much time there. I want us to really spend more of our time in chapter 5, but there's a lot of meat there in chapter 8 that I don't want us to just skip over. So we'll try to do that tonight. Let's see here. Hang on, make sure we're live here. There we go. Okay, so just quick recap. We've not too long here, but Judah has fallen. They've been taken off into captivity. They're in Babylon. Daniel, as we studied a lot, he's been taken off as a young man. We think somewhere in his mid-teens, probably taken captive over into Babylon. Even from early on in those days, we see some of the trials that he went through, some of the trials that his friends went through, and we spent a lot of time so far talking about these visions. As we think about kind of the big themes that are going on in the book of Daniel, we've seen Nebuchadnezzar's dream, this vision he has of this great image, this great statue that are, all these different earthen materials, and of course that vision being revealed to him that, hey, these are world empires that are basically going to come along into the future. We saw the vision of the 4 beasts coming out of the sea. And again, these world empires, these Gentile nations that are going to rise up, that God's going to rise up, and they're going to kind of take us through, a period of time going into the future. And then as Dan spent a little time, the last class, when we got into chapter 8, we see this vision of this pretty scary, ferocious ram with the 2 horns, and it's kind of going around bullying everybody and doing whatever it wants, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere this goat comes along with this great horn, and it goes to battle with the ram. And we've talked a little bit about what we're going to cover a little bit more of that, but we see these great visions, and we talked at the beginning of our class, Jesus refers to this period of time with these nations going along as the age of the Gentiles. And what's kind of, if we think about that, what's been one of the themes we've talked about, whether it's Nebuchadnezzar wrestling with this or as Daniel's seeing these visions, what's kind of a big theme that's jumping out at us with these great nations? What's the big question here? Who's in control, right? And if you remember going back in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has this, obviously he's humiliated and humbled. And when he comes to his senses and he has this just amazing statement about who God is, you recall that one of the things he says is the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. And that's what we're seeing play out. And we're going to see this play out through the future of these things that Daniel sees, right? So with that in mind, when we think about those things taking place, why this thing does not like me. Okay, all right. Daniel chapter 8. So we've seen this kind of vision that he's having with this ram and this goat. And as that vision is explained, we see that the ram is talking about kind of the Medo-Persian Empire. We've got the Medes and the Persians. They basically come together in an alliance. If you recall in the details there in chapter 8, it mentions one of these horns is higher or greater than the other horn. That's a reference to Cyrus the Great. So Cyrus, as we're going to see in the text, with the Babylonian Empire coming to an end, he's kind of the guy. He's the powerful leader out of that Medo-Persian Empire. So looking forward beyond that, right, we see Greece come along into the picture. Again, we haven't gotten quite there yet. I know Dan talked a little bit about Alexander the Great, but you've got the Greek Empire, and they're on the rise, and they're going to come along after the Medo-Persians, and they're going to take over from them. And we see that even going back to the visions of the beast. We go back and we see that in the vision of the great image. We know it's Greece. We know that horn is Alexander the Great. So these things start playing out. I just want to show, quickly as we kind of think about these empires. All right, sorry, there's a lag here. So these great empires, we've got this Neo-Babylonian Empire, right? These are the folks that have taken Daniel, taken his friends, taken the Jews out of the land of Canaan, out of the Judah area. And this is kind of their empire we see. It runs down to about 539 BC. We're going to see, as we get to the end of chapter 5, we're going to see that empire end. We definitively know the Babylonian Empire ends. We know when it ends. We know who is the reason for the end. And that changeover that happens comes along with this Medo-Persian Empire. So, greater even than what we saw with the Babylonians. Beyond that, we see... Sorry, it just doesn't like me here. We see this Greek Empire under Alexander the Great spreads even further. It gets bigger and even further than the two empires before them. And after, really important, this is kind of what I wanted to cover quickly of what we see at the end of chapter 8 as this vision is explained. Alexander the Great, if you recall, he conquered basically the known world in a very short amount of time. And we see that kind of reflected in the text about how swift this goat basically goes and defeats its enemies. Well, what happens when Alexander the Great dies as a young man, he's like in his early 30s when he dies, that empire basically splinters and fragments into four areas. You've got kind of these four generals that worked under him that basically take over these different parts, and you can see those there on the screen and the way they're kind of broken up. Now, if you recall from the text from chapter 8, we see that there's the four horns, and out of those four horns comes a little horn. And there's a significant amount of the text there in chapter 8 that's spent on this little horn and describing what this little horn is and what it's doing and what it says. And that's where I want to spend just a couple of minutes tonight. I will say we're not going to get into this in very much detail tonight, so please read through the notes there that you've got in your hand when you get home. We did this class last quarter, so if you'd like to hear the recording of chapter 8 in more detail, you can find that on the Congregate app. And if you're not sure how to get to that, just ask. I can point you in the right direction. But I did want to talk just for a second about this, unpacking that little horn a little bit here. So Bible scholars, historians, people that have really studied this, that have kind of looked at the events of the things that play out with the things we see in history as we're kind of comparing it here to what we see in the text. Pretty much everybody thinks that this is talking about Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes. So he is one of the guys that kind of comes along out of that Seleucid Empire. If I get us back there, hang on. Shouldn't have clicked backwards. I'm clicking forwards and it's going backwards. Hang on. All right. Okay. All right. No. All right, so this picture here, all right, so that yellow area, right, that Seleucid Empire, they become kind of the dominant one out of this group. And you've got this, these different leaders that come along, but Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, he's kind of this guy that comes out of that area. And, of course, we're skipping over a lot of history that happens in between, but essentially he comes to Jerusalem and he is bad news to the Jews. He's widely regarded as like one of the main villains in Jewish history in the way he goes about treating the Jews there in Jerusalem, and just really, really terrible, nasty stuff that he does. So I think we can see, sorry here, guys. Okay. One of the things that we know about what happened with Antiochus was, and what we see in the text here, there's mention of the regular burnt offerings being stopped, and essentially these people being trampled underfoot, and it's clearly talking about persecution and things that are going on with the Jews. And, in the text there it says the regular burnt offerings were taken away, the sanctuary was overthrown, and there's this mention of the transgression that makes desolate. And essentially they ask the question, how long is this going to go on? In this vision, how long is this going to happen? And it's mentioned 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary will be restored. There's a lot to unpack in there. Some of the things we know that happened with Antiochus, as I mentioned, he's kind of regarded as, just one of the worst people that treated the Jews back in those days. He tore down the walls of Jerusalem, destroyed a bunch of the people's houses, used the debris, all those rocks and stones and stuff, to build a garrison and a fortress there in Jerusalem. He was a Hellenist, so he had kind of been brought up and trained up in the ways of the Greeks. So you think about Greek religion and the Greek gods, Roman gods, that kind of pantheon of things that are going on. Basically outlawed Judaism and was forcing this Hellenistic lifestyle on the Jews there in Jerusalem. He had ordered that the Jewish name for God be changed to Zeus. He was erecting pagan altars all throughout the streets of Jerusalem. He was actually ordering the sacrifice of swine or pigs to their new god. Just brazen things against what they were supposed to be doing as Jews in the old law and the old covenant. Just terrible things. And then specifically that transgression that makes desolate, and talking about the sanctuary being overthrown. One of the things that's recorded that we know happened in late 168 BC, Antiochus actually went into the temple, went inside the temple, erected an altar to Zeus, and then sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple. So you think about basically the worst thing you could possibly do, in the eyes of a Jew with their most sacred, holy place. This guy goes in and just completely defiles and desecrates. And I think that's a pretty clear reference to what's happening here when you read about these things that are going on and the sanctuary being overthrown and how long is this going to happen. There's some debate about what that 2,300 days and nights really means. A lot of folks think that, basically the way the Jews kind of counted time, those days and nights, really that's, I guess, like half those days in terms of 24-hour days that we would think of. And if you do the math on that, it basically is exactly the amount of time that we know between when that happened in 168 and when the temple was restored after the Maccabean revolt, when they went in and kind of rededicated things. It's like a period of just over 3 years. So that math lines up pretty well if we kind of follow that and track that. The Maccabean revolt, again, if we had more time and spend some time on that, if you're not aware what that is, go read about that. It's very fascinating. We've all heard of Hanukkah. Hanukkah comes out of essentially that Maccabean revolt. So when they go in and they restore the temple, and they're restoring all the things that are going on in the temple, that's kind of where that Hanukkah event comes from. So it's really, really interesting to know. Yeah. Yeah, so, and we don't think about that really, but Jesus would have celebrated that event, would have celebrated Hanukkah as a Jew. So really, really interesting stuff. Like I said, I know we're just kind of breezing over this pretty quickly. read the notes. If you want to go back and listen to like the full class on it, it is available to you on the Congregate app. I can show you where to find it. It's not too hard to get a hold of. So we're going to jump over into chapter 5. So if you want to turn to Daniel chapter 5, that's where we're going to spend the rest of our time tonight. This is a great story. It's very interesting. Kate will be embarrassed, but because she told me not to say anything. But I always like to tell her what we're talking about in the adult class. She's my 6-year-old, and I basically gave her a summary of this story, and she's like, "That sounds scary." And I'm like, "Yeah, it is. It is a little scary." And Tyler, I think, had made the comment in the fall quarter when we went through this back in the classroom. He's like, "This is kind of your, archetype of like the ghost story of like somebody goes and messes with some old ancient thing that they shouldn't be touching, and basically a ghost appears and then they die." And it's like, yeah, that's kind of what we see happen in this story, which is really interesting. I never thought about it that way, but that's kind of what we see here. So Daniel chapter 5, also known as the handwriting on the wall, a really, really interesting account here, and it's kind of a great, as we talked about at the beginning of this class too, right? As you think about kind of this chiastic structure that happens in Daniel, where we kind of see almost sort of a mirror of things that take place. This is kind of that mirror image or sort of parallel that we saw with Nebuchadnezzar, right? So Nebuchadnezzar, this great ruler, basically the most powerful guy at the time, and he doesn't understand really who God is. He's struggling with that, and God humbles him. And what did we see? How did we see Nebuchadnezzar? Kind of the last thing we see of him. What's his response?
He makes a great declaration of who God is when he comes to his senses.
It appears that he, in some sort of fashion, I don't know if repent's the right word, but he definitely has a change. We see him acknowledge God. We see him glorify God. He doesn't appear to be the same stubborn old guy that he was before he went through that experience. And I don't know why it's not showing up for you great there, but chapter 5, this is kind of that mirror image in this chiastic structure. So if chapter 4, with kind of this climax of this great Gentile man, ruler acknowledging who God is, we're going to see another great Gentile ruler, and he does not change. He's basically we're going to see kind of the ugly side of the coin of somebody in this same or similar situation.
I think it's interesting, the last verse of chapter 4 says, King Nebuchadnezzar was talking about God, and he said he's able to bring down those who live in pride, which is everything in the book of Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
All of these rulers live in pride.
He acknowledges what his problem was, right? I mean,
And God is going to bring down every one of them.
mm-hmm. Absolutely, and that's kind of what we're going to see tonight. So just to kind of reorient ourselves a little bit, I know, again, most of us aren't history buffs, but just to kind of reorient ourselves a little bit on the timeline, when you think about the things that are going on, again, we're here at really kind of the end of this 70-year captivity prophecy. It's not immediate right after these things happen. We're kind of getting towards the end of these things that were prophesied by Jeremiah. Daniel chapter 5 occurs in 539 BC, and we're pretty confident of that because with what happens, we know when that happens from secular history. So we're pretty confident this is 539 BC. If I'm not mistaken, this is about 10 years after what we just read in chapter 8, something along those lines. So Daniel's probably around 80 years old, something like that.
It's only a little over 20 years after Nebuchadnezzar dies. So time's gone by really quickly since Nebuchadnezzar dies.
Yeah. So yeah, from chapter 4, again, the way Daniel's laid out chapter-wise, it's not really chronological. We're kind of going through the study chronological. That's why we're kind of hopping around a little bit. But yeah, about 25 years after Nebuchadnezzar dies, only about 10 years, we think, from what we just read in chapter 8 is what's going on here. We are in the reign of Belshazzar, and we're going to spend some time really tonight kind of building a little bit of the context for what's going on, because it's real easy to just read this and not really understand, like, well, why is all this going on? There is a little bit of context that we know from the things that were happening around Babylon of kind of why this is set up the way it is. So if we go back and remember our Babylonian kings, and you can go to Wikipedia, you can kind of help yourself and read up on these guys a little bit. But we go from Nabopolassar. He was kind of the first king of the Chaldeans. Again, ruled up to about 605, and that was about when Daniel was taken away. We spent most of our time talking about Nebuchadnezzar II, and he reigns down to about 562 BC. He's really the one primarily that's taking the Jews out in this period of captivity. And then it's just like, once he dies, it is like a soap opera of stuff that happens. His son, this is this evil Merodach guy, which I'm like, Dad, that's like, just sounds like a bad guy. And when your name's Evil Murdoch, you're not a great guy, probably. But interestingly, he's the son of Nebuchadnezzar. He is the one that released Jehoiachin that we read over in 2 Kings. We can kind of read a little bit of that account. He is actually usurped and essentially executed by somebody that's taking power from him. And this is Neriglissar. And he's not apparently really even genealogically, he's not really tied in with any of these people. He's kind of a foreigner himself, apparently. But he's married to one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters. He was actually a general of Nebuchadnezzar, kind of an officer or someone of kind of stature with Nebuchadnezzar. So he's kind of in from that perspective. He rules until he dies in 556, and then his son comes to rule. He doesn't even last a year. It's like 9 months or something, and then he's assassinated by Belshazzar in a coup. So Belshazzar, the guy we're going to read about in this story, he even basically comes to power as kind of a co-ruler along with his father, because he basically assassinates the guy that's in power. So probably not a great guy of moral character to begin with, from what we know about him. But interestingly, right, so Nabonidus is Belshazzar's dad. He's actually the one that gets put in power. So he is like the ruler of the Babylonian Empire. But his son is Belshazzar. And so Belshazzar kind of is like a little bit of a governor, kind of regent over the city of Babylon, it appears, just from some of the things we know about history that goes on. And again, I'm so amazed, and it's clearly God's hand that we have the evidence we do to go and see what people have dug up out of the ground, and we can read about these people and know that, yes, these were real people. They really lived. They really existed in these times, and we can read even about the things they did and said. These are some of the things I thought were interesting that you can go look at with your own eyes if you want, but you can just check them out on Google. That's a relief of Belshazzar there on the left. You can go see that at the British Museum over in London. There's a museum in Istanbul that has kind of these basically writings of Nabonidus and Belshazzar. You can go read about these guys and see whatever they were talking about themselves at the time. And then the Nabonidus Chronicle, there's been these kind of, we've seen some of these things already in our studies. That's kind of what they did back then. You have these cylinders, or you've got kind of these tablets where they're writing all their glorious things about themselves. We've learned a lot about these guys from going and reading some of these things. So I wanted to show too, I think, let's see on this next slide here, if I can get it to go. Yep. So some evidences here of Belshazzar. It's really interesting. Belshazzar is not somebody that we really knew anything about until some of these things were discovered. We've kind of seen stories about things like that from the Bible over the years, where secular people say, oh, well, the Bible's not reliable because we can't find anything about David or, person over here from the Bible. Belshazzar was kind of an example of that. There was a lot of people criticizing the book of Daniel that, oh, Daniel's not legitimate because this guy Belshazzar, no one's ever heard of him. Well, lo and behold, in 1854, some Brits go over to that area and they're digging stuff up, and they find these cylinders, the Nabonidus cylinders as they're called, and they talk about Belshazzar, his son, which is really, really interesting, really cool that we can go and see that stuff. They were actually found at the ziggurat at Ur. So that picture down in the bottom, that's an actual photograph. That's not a drawing. That's kind of hard to see from here, but this is a great picture. You can see one of our U.S. servicemen sitting at the bottom of the footsteps of that thing, just so you can kind of see how big that structure is. over in Ur. And if you remember Ur, the Chaldees, that's kind of the area where Abraham took off from way, way back. That's kind of where he left from. So when we think about Abraham coming from a, polytheistic culture and with all their pagan gods and stuff, for sure. Yeah, so it really gives you some perspective on kind of those times. The cylinder that actually mentions Belshazzar, it talks about, the quote here says, "As for me, Nabonidus, king of Babylon, save me from sinning against your great Godhead, and grant me as a present a lifelong of days. And as for Belshazzar, my eldest son, my offspring, instill reverence for your great Godhead in his heart, and may he not commit any cultic mistake. May he be satiated with a life of plenitude." So, he's obviously appealing to his Babylonian gods here and these things, but, he talks specifically about Belshazzar being his oldest son. So we see some of these evidences of things that are going on here. What I want to spend a little time on tonight, again, we're kind of world building a little bit of the things that are going on in chapter 5. We'll read the text, part of the text here in just a moment, but we've talked a little bit about Babylon as a city already. It was a formidable city. I think Dad had made the point in one of our classes when we read Jonah's account about Nineveh and what a great city Nineveh was, and it took you 3 days basically to walk all around the city of Nineveh. Babylon was just an enormous place. Historians think that at this time in history, Babylon was probably the most populated city in the world. So, lots and lots of people living there, and just the structure of it is just enormous. It's a little hard to see on the left, but those are actually Babylonian. That's Babylonian writings, again, from King Nabonidus. So this is Belshazzar's dad. And this specifically is talking about essentially a building project he did in 547. So, 539 is what we're going to read in this. So, back it up just a little bit of time there, 547. And it talks about the great lengths he went to in building up the walls even bigger than they were before. And you kind of wonder about that, or is that just ego, or what are these guys doing here? Clearly, they do have ego about themselves. But there's some other things happening here. These cylinders refer to his efforts. The finished wall was apparently 100 feet tall and 30 feet wide. It was just a monster. And they're building this great, formidable, just impenetrable city that, as they think, no one can come in here, no one can mess with us. We are the best. Just basically impossible to attack. And historians actually believe that they think that maybe 10 to 20 years of provisions of things to, basically food and water and things that would have kept them in that city. So if there was a siege or something, they could have lasted 10 years or more just without having to even worry about what's going on the outside. It's just incredible. So why is this going on? Why are they building these walls up? Well, part of what we know is going on at this time, too, is that the Medes and the Persians are on the move. And they are starting to really basically come around to where they're setting their sights on Babylon, and, where we get our expression writing on the wall, the writing's starting to be on the wall. They're kind of getting close to Babylon and starting to approach. If I can get it to go here. Okay. Yeah, so this Persian Empire, right? You've got kind of the rise of Cyrus, Cyrus II, or Cyrus the Great, as he's known. They are on their conquest, and they are going through, and they are just taking everybody out and approaching the city of Babylon. That starts, around 550 BC. They've basically conquered. Cyrus has taken all of the territories of Mede, getting up into Asia Minor. So you think about Lydia, where it's modern-day Turkey, getting up in that area. And he's basically ready to go towards Babylon. And so at the end of 539 BC, it says, this is September of 539 BC, his army has essentially taken out the Babylonian forces outside of the city. So if I'm living in the city of Babylon, this is happening outside. I probably know this is going on even. Things are taking place here. And he's getting ready to kind of launch his great assault on the city of Babylon. Interestingly, they essentially, since they've conquered outside of the city, when that picture we just saw, we know the river runs kind of right there alongside the city and actually kind of goes through part of the city there. So they've got control of the river now at this point, and that's actually part of how they take Babylon, as having control of the city. So you got Belshazzar sitting there on the inside, and they're basically surrounded. And what do they decide to do? We're going to have a big party. let's throw a big party because we're good. We're in here, and nobody can mess with us. We're set up pretty nice and sweet in our fortress here, and no one can come inside. And so that's what you can see kind of the walls there, renderings there of what it may have looked like there on those walls of Babylon. But we're going to throw a party. We're going to have this great feast, and we're just going to kind of revel in ourselves that we're untouchable. Nobody can come in here, which is obviously arrogant and foolish. But that's what we see starting to happen here. And again, regardless of what the motivation was here, he calls for this celebration, this feast, and that's where we kind of start there in chapter 5, verse 1. It's interesting, there's all kinds of, just going and Googling Belshazzar's feast, there are so many paintings and things that people have painted throughout the years. This clearly is like something that people think is interesting enough that I'm going to sit down and make a painting, a really elaborate painting. Yes? Yeah, bend the knee or whatever, right? Yeah.
You guys just keep doing what you're doing. And Belshazzar, if I'm not mistaken, just like, no, we're going to do our own thing. And that's kind of where the writing came from.
Well, I think that's kind of that area up in Turkey. That was kind of what happened with the guy that was up there. They basically were like, we ain't doing that. And then they just went in and took him out. Yeah, so that seems to be kind of a little bit of what's happening here for sure. Again, it's just amazing to me that so much of this stuff exists. This is actually part of the city of Babylon, and this is where archaeologists think, there's essentially a pretty big room there on site, and they think this might have been where that feast was going on, because it's kind of seems like, I guess for what they know of how archaeology works and kind of what stuff was used for, they think this might have been the area where they were actually doing this very thing. It was the Babylonian ballroom, yeah, if you want to think of it that way. But again, it's just amazing just how many people have gone and painted these great paintings, throughout the centuries. And we can kind of start to, as we read this, it just kind of comes to life of what we see happening, taking place here. Just as we talk about Babylon and this fortress that it is, and the way, whether it's just Belshazzar or the people that are inside, taking such refuge there, does it remind you of any other city that we think about in the Bible? And the way people kind of thought about themselves is, we're okay here. Jericho would be a great one. I didn't think about that one, but Jericho, yeah, didn't work out for those guys either. What about Jerusalem? I mean, Jerusalem was a place that, nobody can touch us here. They thought, we're impenetrable here. It's amazing to me if you go, and we're going to talk. This will probably come back up again as we get into the destruction of Jerusalem later. But if you go read back in Deuteronomy 28, this is when the people are basically being given the curses, the blessings and the curses, right? And the curses are a lot more than the blessings. But one of the statements out of Deuteronomy 28, and this is verse 52, it says, "They shall besiege you in all your towns until your high and fortified walls in which you trusted come down throughout all your land, and they shall besiege you in all your towns throughout all your land, which the Lord your God has given you." And we see that happen with the Israelites, with the Jews, thinking, we're inside our city walls. This is God's city. Nothing can happen to us. And that doesn't work out for them. They're trusting in man-made things versus trusting in the Lord. And that's kind of, obviously Belshazzar's not trusting in the Lord, but they think, nobody can touch us in here. Instead of humbling themselves and appealing to God. So we're going to read the text now. Let's go to Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. We're just going to read down through verse 12 tonight, and then we'll pick back up with 13 on Sunday. But let's read this together. So it's verse 1. "King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. So we can just see this. I mean, we can just see this happening, right? It's just so vivid. You can see these things happening, and everybody, probably is freaking out. I mean, I would be if I'm sitting in the room and I see this happening. So we'll continue reading here. It says, the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet hall, and the queen declared, "O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation." All right, lots of questions here. A lot of questions. One of the things I want to point out, mentions as she's talking there. Obviously, we know Belshazzar is not Nebuchadnezzar's son. He's not Nebuchadnezzar's son directly. I think the consensus here is, they're it's kind of like forefather kind of a thing, right, in terms of rulers. It's clearly Belshazzar is not the direct descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know if you.
I think it's just using figure of speech.
Yeah.
It's his great-great-grandfather.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Kind of a predecessor type language, kind of a little bit more figurative here. So they're having this great big party, and they're drinking, and he has this idea to go fetch what? What does he tell them to go get? All the fine china from what is, great-grandfather, however, all the things they took out of the temple, right, when they went and kind of pillaged Jerusalem and took these people captive. I think I've got a picture of this, right? So, you can go back and reference this stuff, when that actually happened. 2 Kings 24 talks about Nebuchadnezzar carrying off all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. And they cut in pieces all the vessels of gold in the temple that the Lord, which Solomon, the king of Israel, had made, and as the Lord had foretold. 2 Chronicles 36, Jeremiah 52, some of these exact references of some of these things that were taken out, right? So obviously they're probably not taking all this stuff out for their party, but some of these things were things that they obviously had sitting in storage somewhere, and he knew about it, and he said, "Hey, go drag that stuff out. We're going to use some of that stuff tonight for my guests."
I've read that it says, we're going to have to text, say, 1,000 of his lords. And I've read that under the Persians, that's Cyrus, it was not unusual that routinely they would have feasts with 15,000 people.
Yeah.
So when we say 1,000, lords, it was a big deal. And I don't think that was uncommon.
I guess we would maybe think of like if you've ever been to a big exhibit, like a big ballroom kind of thing where everyone is sitting around tables and they're they've got people coming in, bringing food, drinks, and stuff. Probably something kind of like that is kind of the vision here. I thought this, I know it's hard to see from this, but this is basically a rendering of the temple and some of these exact things. It talks about the bronze pillars and things like that were taken away. This is the kind of stuff that Nebuchadnezzar took off and took out of Jerusalem when they conquered it, and they brought it back to the city of Babylon. So this stuff's just sitting around in some sort of storage area, and he says, let's drag that stuff out. So does that seem like a good idea? He thought it was a good idea. He'd also been drinking, though, so probably not a great sense of judgment here. When does the hand appear on the wall? I guess kind of tied to this being a good idea or not. What was that? Yeah, it says immediately. They go and fetch this stuff, and they bring it out, and immediately this starts happening. This hand starts writing on the wall. We're going to talk more about this, obviously, next class, but what can we kind of infer about what's going on here? I know we're not getting into the interpretation, but why is God doing this? What do you think what has Belshazzar done that he should not have done?
Well, I think it's in verse 4. They drank wine and praise to the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone. They gave no homage whatsoever to the Lord God, the Holy One in heaven. And you see it in other places too. I mean, you see it when the Israelites come out of Egypt and Moses disappears into the mountain and they say to Aaron, build us a God. And they build a God and they said, this is the God that brought you out of the land of Egypt. And God's fierce anger came against his people just like it came against Belshazzar here.
Yeah.
They were using the things from the temple of Jerusalem to defile God, basically.
It's like, yeah.
Some say that by bringing those things out that were in the temple, he's trying to show how great the Babylonian gods are because they conquered the Jews. And so he's dishonoring the one God, but he's trying to raise up his gods. And of course, what we see in verse 4, it seems like that as soon as they started all that, the hand starts writing.
There's some extreme disrespect here going on of God's name and the things that he's said are holy. I think all those responses are great. It reminds me of when the Philistines have the Ark of the Covenant, and we see the things that kind of go on there when they take it back to their essentially their temple, and it's doesn't work out good for them either. And they're like, hey, we don't want this thing anymore. Get it out of here. It's kind of what it reminded me of a little bit. How does Belshazzar react when this starts happening? This hand just appears and starts writing on the wall. What do we see Belshazzar do?
In shock. And he's terrified.
He's scared to death. Yeah, he just goes flush white probably, and he is absolutely terrified. I think it's fascinating to me that it mentions his knees are knocking together. I mean, he's about to lose it. Just completely.
From that language, it seems like he's just trembling. He's just shaking all over.
We can only imagine too, but part of what I love about all these old paintings, this is a Rembrandt painting, so if you know anything about art and art history and stuff, Rembrandt, that was painted in 1636. You can go see that over in London, but I'm sure he was terrified, but probably everybody else was too. Nobody had seen anything like this before. I mean, are you kidding me? The hand just appears out of nowhere and starts writing on the wall, especially if I'm sure people had been drinking, that probably had an effect too, but they're just, you can just imagine just the fear in the room, just palpable probably.
It doesn't say that he kind of whispered to somebody, bring the magicians in, or whatever. It's like he cries out loud, get them in here now.
Yeah. Which that was going to be my next thing. So he's terrified. What does he do? Spoiler, but what does he do? This is the protocol, right? We've seen this before. Where did we see this before? Nebuchadnezzar did the same thing. Go call this guy and this guy and this guy. Bring all these people in here, right? And like we saw before, what can they not do? They don't have a clue. They don't know what's going on. It's like the way the text even reads, it reminds me, it's like all the king's horses, all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. It's like the Chaldeans, the astrologers, they all come. They don't know what to do. They have no clue.
What's common in all their reactions is they know it's not good news. They know it's not good. Whatever's happened here, whatever it needs to be explained to me here, I know it's not going to be good, but I still need to know.
Yes.
Well, it seems like they understood it was judgment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Judgment was,
And it all comes from their pridefulness. Every single time they lifted themselves so far above anything that they ever could imagine themselves to be, and they were brought down very low.
So cliffhanger, because I think we're at time, but we'll pick back up with this on Sunday. But think a little bit about, like we just said, it's only been about 25-ish years since Nebuchadnezzar died. And think a little bit about, that's not that much time has passed. And it seems pretty clear here. Belshazzar has no idea who Daniel is. He has no idea that Daniel's around, that Daniel can help. But this queen that's referenced, she knows about Daniel. So think on that a little bit about, why has Belshazzar just forgotten the history of his fathers? And again, not that much time's passed. So cliffhanger. We'll pick back up with Daniel chapter 5 on Sunday. But thank you guys for your attention and comments tonight.